I have run the sealing protocol on 41 subjects across 9 species. I am telling you about the 40th because it is the one that ended the protocol, and because the report I filed afterward is the last honest thing I wrote in that lab. My name is Ith Soren. I hold the calibration seat in the Threshold Kinetics Division, which is a polite way of saying, I decide how hard a body can be pushed before it stops being useful data. The sealing bay is my ward. 4 of us worked it. Myself, 2 junior calibrators, and a recorder named Den, who complained about the coffee ration more than he complained about the work, which I respected. The subject was human, Walt Renner, 61 years old by his own reckoning, a retired cargo loader from a coastal freight yard on a world we had catalogued as unremarkable in every column of the survey. He had answered a labor exchange notice for paid physiological trials because, he told Den on the intake scan, his knees didn't let him load pallets anymore, and the money was good. He signed the consent forms without reading past the second page. He asked if the chair reclined. We had run 3 human subjects before him, and I want to be honest about how little they had taught us. Humans, as a species entry, sit in our archive under a modest musculature classification, unremarkable frame, unremarkable bone density, nothing that had ever earned the file a flag. The 3 prior subjects had produced curves within a percentile of what our models predicted, close enough that I had begun to think the species' reputation among the frontier crews, the quiet unease certain veteran officers carried about them, never quite explained, was overstated superstition dressed up as caution. I had said as much to Osa once, over the coffee ration Den always complained about. She had not argued with me. She had simply said that a sample of 3 was not a sample, and gone back to her fatigue tables. I logged Renner's intake as routine. Nothing in his file suggested otherwise. I want to be precise about what the sealing protocol measures, because the word strength undersells it. We do not ask a subject to lift something and record the number. We attach neuromuscular sensors along the major kinetic chains, run a subject through a graduated series of resisted exertions, and chart the curve of output against effort. Every species we have tested, the Voron, the Districki, 3 human subjects before Renner, even the reinforced frame OSEC dockworkers, produces the same shape of curve. Output climbs steeply at first, then bends. It approaches a ceiling. The ceiling is the whole point of the protocol. You find it, you log it, you close the file. Renner's curve did not bend. The first session was routine. Standard resisted press, standard force plate, standard climb toward a baseline we expected to plateau somewhere in the range his musculature and mass predicted. A modest number, nothing worth Den looking up from his tablet. It did not plateau. It kept climbing in a straight, patient line until the plate itself gave a small metallic complaint, and the readout blanked to a fault code. Dench looked up then. I logged it as an equipment fault. This is the correct procedure. Equipment fails. It is the least interesting explanation, and therefore, the first one you rule out. We replaced the plate. Second session, 3 days later. Renner sat down, rubbed his hands together the way he did before every set. A habit, not a ritual, he assured me when I asked. He just liked the feel of it, and asked whether we wanted the good arm or the other one. Den laughed. I did not, because I was watching the readout, and the readout climbed past the fault threshold of the previous plate and kept going. We had reinforced the housing. It held for 11 seconds longer than the first one had. Then it did not hold. I want to describe Renner's face in that moment, because it is the detail I return to. He was not straining. There was no reddening, no held breath. None of the tells we catalog in every species under maximal exertion. He looked mildly apologetic, the way a man looks when he has stepped on someone's foot in a crowded transit car. He said, "Sorry, I don't know why it does that." And he meant it. He was not performing modesty for us. He genuinely did not know. That is the part our models could not accommodate. Every prior subject who exceeded a predicted ceiling had done so knowingly, through training, through desperation, through some conscious override we could locate and measure. Renner was not overriding anything. He was sitting in a chair, half bored, producing numbers that our instruments were not built to survive, and he did not know it was strange. By the 4th session, I had stopped predicting ceilings. I had started predicting equipment failure points instead, which is a different kind of chart entirely, and a worse one to be running. We rebuilt the housing twice more. We isolated the sensor array from the resistance plate so a failure in one would not cascade into the other. I brought in a second calibrator, Osa Teren, whose specialty was structural fatigue in industrial systems, not living subjects, because at that point, I trusted her instruments more than my own protocol. Osa asked Renner, on her first day observing, what he had done for exercise before the trials. He said he'd unloaded freight containers by hand for 31 years because the yard's lift equipment was always breaking down and nobody wanted to wait for a repair crew. He said it the way a man reports a mildly interesting fact about his commute. He did not connect it to anything we were measuring. I do not think it occurred to him that there was anything to connect. Between the fourth and fifth sessions, Osa ran her own quiet test, separate from the protocol, that she only told me about afterward. She had pulled the load logs from Renner's old freight yard, public labor records, nothing invasive, and cross-referenced them against the yard's maintenance history. The lift equipment had been in disrepair for most of a decade, exactly as he'd said. For those years, the tonnage moved by hand across his shift roughly matched the tonnage the yard's official records credited to machines that were, according to the same records, broken. Nobody had reconciled the numbers because nobody had thought to ask a loading dock to explain itself. Osa printed the discrepancy out and left it on my desk without comment. I understood the comment anyway. The fifth session is the one in my report, and the one the division still argues about. We had built, by then, a resistance rig, rated 3 times past any output we had ever recorded from any species in the archive, a number chosen, frankly, out of professional embarrassment, because I did not want to explain a fourth broken instrument to my superiors. Renner sat down. Dench ran the calibration check twice, out of nerves, and Renner waited without complaint, looking mildly bored, the same way he'd looked in every prior session. The curve climbed. It passed the output of the strongest OSSEC dockworker on record, which we had considered, until that week, the practical ceiling for musculoskeletal output in any species we studied. It kept climbing. It passed the threshold we had built the rig to survive by a margin of nearly 40%, and the rig held, and Renner was still not straining, and somewhere in that stretch of seconds, I understood that we were not measuring a ceiling at all. We were measuring how much of his own output he happened to be using that day, on a resisted press, in a chair, out of mild curiosity about whether the machine would do that thing again. I called the session, not because the rig failed, it did not, but because I realized I had no defensible number to write down as a limit, and a calibrator who cannot state a limit has no protocol left to run. Renner asked if we were done for the day. I told him yes. He asked, entirely without irony, whether we'd found what we were looking for. I told him I was not certain we had been looking for the right thing. The division closed the sealing protocol 9 days later, officially for instrumentation review, which is the phrase we use when we mean we have run out of instruments that can survive the subject. Renner went home with his trial payment and, as far as I know, resumed complaining about his knees. He never asked what the numbers meant. I do not think he wanted to know, and I have come to believe that not wanting to know was never modesty on his part. It was simply that the number had never mattered to him in the first place, only the pallet in front of him, and whether it needed moving. My final entry in the file reads, Subject ceiling not established. Protocol limit reached before subject limit. Recommend the division stop asking humans how strong they are and start asking what they have been quietly carrying their entire lives without bothering to notice. I have not run the sealing protocol since.